Hello, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, presented by the MulteFire Alliance and 451 Research. Our seminar today is Bringing Seamless Connectivity to the Enterprise. My name is Ken Rehbeen. I am from 451 Research as a principal analyst covering wireless technology, and I will serve as your moderator today. Presenting with me are two experts in the evolution of wireless technology, Amit Jain from SpiderCloud Wireless and Mike Carper from Nokia. SpiderCloud is a leading innovator taking a fresh approach to the challenge of in-building connectivity through its E-RAN system of small cells. Nokia is one of the dominant suppliers of LTE technology network infrastructure around the world. Nokia has long served as a pillar of many major LTE networks now found around the globe. Following the acquisition of Alcatel-Lucent, Nokia's impressive small cell development merged with the equally impressive efforts ongoing at Alcatel to build interesting in-building enterprise solutions. It would be tough to find a better set of co-speakers. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. After our discussion, we'll be having a brief question and answer period. We would enjoy taking your questions and responding to them at that time. To submit a question, just click on the question button that you see within the webinar interface. And we'll strive to get as many questions as possible addressed. But if we run out of time, someone will get back to you with a response following the webinar. In addition, a copy of the presentation will be made available to all attendees. We also ask you to provide us feedback that you may have from today's presentations and suggestions for doing things better. Okay, well, with that, let's get started on our topic. Well, few technologies have had as much of an impact on global communications as LTE. Since entering the market towards the end of the 2000s, the LTE technology has expanded dramatically. It is well established across most of the markets, and it continues to grow. Our research at 451 anticipates steady growth of the global enterprise mobile devices as enterprises shift their efforts or shift their IT technology infrastructure from local servers to cloud-based solutions, and the workforce shifts from being office building centric to mobile. This combination is very potent for the enterprise, and LTE offers mature and proven radio technology that has greater benefit because of the broad economy of scale that comes from widely followed mobile radio technology standards that are published in the 3GPP standards community. E in LTE stands for evolution. And to be sure, the evolution of LTE is not yet finished. There are standards that are coming to market early in 2017 that bring an additional set of features that will have tremendous impact on LTE. And our speakers will go into some of those enhancements. One of the key enhancements we're going to see in 2017 is LTE benefits thanks to these standards evolving. Moving from beyond licensed spectrum that is held by service providers, mobile operators, to unlicensed spectrum bands that are potentially available to any enterprise. In the enterprise, the challenge for supporting wireless continues to grow. As we've seen around our household, there are more wireless devices. There are more people using wireless devices. There are more types of wireless devices. We are starting to evolve past a mobile broadband, voice calling, texting paradigm to a more encompassing wireless capability that now extends to objects, machine to machine technology, sometimes called the Internet of Things. Enterprises face interesting challenges trying to support the diversity of applications that utilize wireless technology. And because mobile broadband, the cloud, has now become such a foundation of corporate operation, the airwaves inside the enterprise are getting very busy. Wi-Fi requires access points to support this traffic load. And the density of these access points can be a challenge to support from an operational point of view. Wi-Fi as a technology harkens back to the days of Ethernet. And that is one of the strengths of Wi-Fi. It is not a scheduled, guaranteed capability, but it's a very adaptable one. That adaptability, though, can cause issues, because if there's contention as a Wi-Fi device is utilizing the air interface, it backs off. And the mechanisms for backing off and waiting and trying again, while they're certainly proven, they've been around a long time, they are amazingly inefficient. New approaches for looking at how radio communications occur with perhaps a little more rigor become possible if we start looking at LTE and combining it with Wi-Fi. And we'll hear a little bit more about that shortly. Finally, Wi-Fi was not really built for mobility. Access points are not designed to be cellular base stations handing off calls from one to another. For sure, there are some approaches to do this that are vendor specific, but it's been more of an add-on and not a consistent add-on in how that works. Wi-Fi security as well has evolved over time, which can create challenges in the administration of an enterprise environment. And then finally, we're seeing now voice calling, moving from a wide area network such as an LTE network or a CDMA GSM network to Wi-Fi networks. And it can be very difficult to get emergency services location information in a corporate environment if somebody should be having a health emergency. The location information does not flow automatically to a call center that's dealing with the call for help. And then finally, with the mechanism that Wi-Fi uses to do its job, there are limitations in how much coverage and capacity. And because of those limitations, there is a need for greater density of the access points to handle a significant traffic load. Unfortunately, as Wi-Fi traffic ramps up, the drop-off in effectiveness of the network can be quite rapid when the network reaches saturation. So Wi-Fi is very important technology and very foundational, but it does have its limits. The global standards community has been working on ways to take some of the advantages of LTE and apply them in an unlicensed band. And some of the innovators in this area have look beyond the initial approach, which depends upon a service provider, a mobile operator, offering LTE and then supplementing it with the unlicensed. MulteFire, a new innovation from these innovators, takes an innovative approach by asking the question, is it mandatory that there be a licensed LTE service operating to support the unlicensed? And they have come up with a technology that frees LTE from an unlicensed anchor. And because of the careful work that has been carried out in 3GPP to ensure that LTE coexists in the same spectrum with Wi-Fi through mechanisms such as listen before talk, the two can coexist very peacefully. So it ends up being the best of both worlds and an interesting path to the future for enterprises that are looking for ever more interesting ways to deploy networks throughout the corporation. So what is MulteFire? At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Mike Carper. Mike, if you could just say a little bit about yourself and help the audience understand exactly what is this thing that we call MulteFire.
Thanks, Ken. I'd be happy to do that. So I'm with Nokia. I serve as the coordination point for all the MulteFire activities within Nokia currently. And as Ken mentioned at the outset, I actually come from the Alcatel-Lucent side of the acquisition, where I ran the small cells program on the outdoor side for Alcatel. MulteFire is a great technology, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it come to fruition and deployment. So just briefly, I've been in telecom since 1982 and in wireless since 1985. Seen a lot of changes over the years, but I got to tell you, this is one that is really exciting, and I'm glad to be part of this particular program. So a little about MulteFire. It basically provides LTE-like performance with Wi-Fi-like deployment simplicity. And the points on this slide that we're looking at here are, I'm going to unpack these a little bit, but first of all, it is LTE-based technology for small cells, and it can operate in both unlicensed and shared spectrum. So that's a bit of a mouthful. Let me unpack that briefly. So LTE, as we all know, is a global, high-performance, ubiquitously deployed, hardened, mature technology. But as Ken mentioned earlier, it's also continually improving. So LTE is the best wireless technology by far that we have deployed, and we're going to take that and have it as the basis for MulteFire. So from a performance perspective, from a hardened perspective, from a globally available perspective, it's going to bring that to market. And also, we mentioned here, it's really aimed at small cells. And the reason for that is a couple, but primarily globally there are power constraints on the level of output power that unlicensed spectrum can use. So typically in the 5 gigahertz range, which is a global standard, it's 1 watt or less in almost every country. And so by definition, it is well suited to a small cell in terms of the platform that deploys that. LTE on the macro cells and MulteFire doesn't make a great deal of sense, primarily because a macro cell or a big footprint would just have too much coverage, and the listen before talk techniques required to fairly share the spectrum wouldn't play well in that environment. Unlicensed and shared spectrum, just briefly, so shared spectrum and unlicensed both have similar techniques and needs in terms of the ability to sense if there's any users on a particular channel and wait until it's free before it goes forward. Sometimes we refer to the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum in the U.S. as a shared spectrum rather than an unlicensed as an example, but the technology is the same in both cases. MulteFire will bring enhanced data and voice services to local area deployments. Now, since MulteFire uses LTE, it inherently has access to all of the features and capabilities that LTE brings to the table, both now and in the future. So MulteFire is going to, you can think of it as a feature on LTE, and so all of the basic LTE capabilities that exist, MulteFire can use and employ and enjoy. So it's a superior technology in terms of how to provide a wireless service. The MulteFire alliances have both technical and business teams involved, and a couple of the areas of business focus include the enterprise, which is, of course, the focus of today's webinar. But MulteFire also is well suited to a variety of other markets: industrial access, Internet of Things network, neutral host, and so on. And so while today we're going to focus on enterprise, I just want you to be clear that it's available elsewhere as well. Okay. Finally, this broadens the LTE ecosystem to new and existing wireless providers. Because it operates solely in an unlicensed spectrum, MulteFire provides the ability for really anyone to provide wireless service. So a great model here is, you can think of a large enterprise office building, and the owner of the building, the company, decides to deploy a MulteFire network. They can do so freely, but in addition, it could be a venue owner, a stadium owner that decides to deploy their own wireless network that can serve ubiquitously anybody that comes into the venue. It could be a transportation hub, it could be oil, gas mining, it could be a factory, it could be anywhere wireless service is desired without the need to reach out to a mobile operator to either lease spectrum or partner in some way. So it really does broaden the ecosystem. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide. So this slide speaks a little bit about the various forms of unlicensed spectrum and how they're being used in the industry today and in the future. So I'm going to actually refer to the slide here a little bit. The top row talks about licensed spectrum being combined with unlicensed spectrum and how that works. And so there's a couple of different techniques. One is LTE-U or LTE unlicensed, and that is actually being rolled out now in North America by a particular operator. That's not so much a standards-based technology, but it basically combines both licensed and unlicensed spectrum together. So this is handy in the case where a mobile operator has licensed spectrum available, but it's limited to that particular use case. It's not available to anybody without a licensed spectrum. LAA takes a step further. It's actually a standard-based combination of licensed spectrum and unlicensed spectrum. And this is important for MulteFire because this particular standard is actually what we're basing MulteFire on top of. So LAA, License Assisted Access, is the framework and the groundwork for the unlicensed portion. But again, this combines both licensed and unlicensed together. Another technique using licensed spectrum is known as LWA, LTE Wi-Fi aggregation, where LTE and Wi-Fi can aggregate data traffic at a higher level, again, and needs a licensed spectrum. So if we focus on the unlicensed piece, the two technologies today, of course, Wi-Fi, which you're very familiar with, and then MulteFire comes into this space. So it broadens the LTE ecosystem to allow new deployment opportunities without a licensed spectrum, and that's really the key. So it brings the power and the performance of LTE solely in the unlicensed space and enables really anybody to use that. So sorry for the alphabet soup on this one, but you may hear about unlicensed spectrum, you may hear about these other technologies. This is just a handy little reference chart to see how they fit together and how they're different. Okay, improved capacity and performance. So MulteFire brings the opportunity to cover more area and devices, therefore, with fewer nodes than Wi-Fi. So a little bit about this. So the standards have been just established for MulteFire, at least the first release of the standards. And companies both my company, Nokia, and Qualcomm have each run independent simulations to measure the performance result of that, and we came to the identical conclusions. In both cases, we have proven that the performance for MulteFire is better than twice in terms of coverage and in terms of capacity that of Wi-Fi. And in some simulation models, it goes up to 3 times or even 4 times the capacity and coverage. The reason it can do this is that while they're both operating in the same frequency, say 5 gigahertz, for example, and they both have the same output power, say 1 watt or less, LTE as a technology is inherently different than Wi-Fi. LTE was built to manage interference much better. It was designed from the ground up to do that. And so the footprint of the AP, the footprint of the cell basically, is much bigger because it's able to manage the interference further you are away from the cell. This is really important because from a deployment perspective, you can get by with much fewer nodes to provide equivalent coverage and capacity. So it really is advantageous from that perspective. MulteFire also supports mobility inside and outside the building, and this is really key. It will be able to provide seamless service continuity handoffs as you roam to and from, say, an LTE network. So you can imagine a scenario where you're outside an office building, say, you're up on a call or maybe have a data session going. You keep that service up, alive, active as you transition inside to your office. So you can imagine the case where you're running a little late. You join a conference call or a webinar on your phone, on your mobile device, as you're driving into work. You walk from the parking lot into your office, and voila, the call on the service stays up. Or conversely, you start a call in your office, and you can seamlessly transition as you walk to the parking lot and into your car and drive home and keep all that service up. So it's really some good advantageous advantages that MulteFire brings in this scenario. Some additional points on MulteFire is it leverages LTE's strong security, authentication, and other features. So LTE, as Ken mentioned at the outset, provides far superior security via the extensible authentication protocol that's built into the LTE networks. So it's far superior on that front. And it supports all the rich feature set that LTE brings, things like voice over LTE, broadcast features, better interference management, I mentioned already, advanced radio resource management. And we haven't touched on capacity yet, but from a capacity standpoint, when LTE packs data into its waveform, it does so far more efficiently than Wi-Fi. And so from a capacity perspective, MulteFire, since it's based on LTE, can deliver superior performance, superior payloads to the user devices. And I think with that one, I'll move forward to MulteFire in the enterprise. And I think, Ken, I'll hand it back to you now. And,
thank you, Mike.
We can go forward.
That's a very helpful introduction to what MulteFire is as an evolution of LTE and taking LTE into a new space. What I think would be good right now would be to turn this over to Amit Jain, who has a tremendous amount of experience servicing enterprise needs. Amit, could you reflect on some of the benefits that might directly flow to an enterprise that embraces MulteFire?
Thanks, Ken. So at SpiderCloud, we work with a lot of enterprise customers. And one of the things that we have noticed over the years is that seamless mobility is now mission critical for the enterprise. It is not just sufficient to have wireless connectivity in some parts of the building, or users don't find it acceptable that they have to constantly log in, log out of different networks, see their network switch between one kind of Wi-Fi inside the building, then step out to the macro network and deal with all the transitions. People just want to have seamless mobility. Now, if you look, as I think you mentioned earlier on in the webinar, the LTE radio interface is providing that kind of seamless mobility across like large swaths of the world today, with hundreds of mobile operators using that technology. But so far, it has been difficult for difficult for enterprises to use the same technology that carriers or operators are able to use, because they don't have a licensed spectrum, and they don't have experts who can deploy and optimize LTE networks. So I think that's where MulteFire comes in. It is really changing the game. It is now making it possible for the enterprise to have a secure and private network with the same kind of quality and features that large mobile operators can deliver. They can now have seamless mobility within the enterprise, and as Mike mentioned earlier, with a fewer number of access points, which means a smaller investment, lower costs compared to what they're able to do with Wi-Fi, and also and make sure that this mobility works across their enterprise environment and the outdoor cellular network. And finally, they can get these things in a way that they can deploy it themselves. I think the simplicity of MulteFire is critical in helping the enterprise build these kind of networks. So yes, I think this we really feel that MulteFire would be a huge advance for a lot of enterprises who are trying to build their own mission critical mobile networks. Ken, back to you.
Lovely. So let's leave this slide up for a bit, because what I'd like to do now is move into a question and answer period. For our listeners out there, we're eager to take your questions, and if you have one, please use the interface on the web presentation, click on the question button, and submit your question. And we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So let me start. And Amit, let me begin with you. Why not Wi-Fi? Can't Wi-Fi do all of this and maybe even more for enterprises?
Well, it's a lot of enterprises have deployed Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is very, very, very prevalent in the enterprise today, and so what we're doing with MulteFire is solving some of the problems that Wi-Fi, or at least current generation Wi-Fi, is unable to solve. I think Mike Carper talked about many of those when he was explaining the MulteFire interface. The benefits of MulteFire is how we are providing a better, more robust air interface. So this means that you would get consistent throughput throughout the throughout the building, and get it with a fewer number of access points, which means there are cost savings for the enterprise. Security is critical today, as more and more devices are connected to mobile networks, wireless networks inside the enterprise, and that is one of the strengths of LTE, which extends over to MulteFire, and then MulteFire is providing more capacity for the Internet of Things, and from an enterprise point of view, as over the next several years, not only would you have all the smartphones and mobile devices that people have, but you'll be bringing a large number of other devices in the enterprise which would need to be connected. And I think that is another place where all the investment that's happening in LTE on enabling the Internet of Things translates over to MulteFire. So I think there are very significant advantages compared to Wi-Fi and benefits that the enterprise would get. Now, we're not saying that enterprises need to replace Wi-Fi with MulteFire, but instead look at these newer use cases around higher density of devices, IoT, security, how you're working between the enterprise network and the cellular network. So look at these new use cases and consider MulteFire as a way of solving these use cases.
Wonderful. Something I think might be of interest to the folks following this webinar is timing. Where are we in terms of MulteFire moving from a specification to real deployments?
All right, so let me
Mike or
first.
yeah. Or,
yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, Nokia makes and sells Wi-Fi equipment, LTE equipment, and we're in the process of designing and building MulteFire equipment. So I just wanted to emphasize again what Amit had said, is that MulteFire is not intended to replace Wi-Fi, nor is it intended to replace LTE. Those product lines will continue to have a viable and long future. But MulteFire is going to open up new avenues for us and new use cases, and is additive to any kind of a wireless deployment that's available today. So with that in mind, I can mention the specification, the initial release specification just baselined this week. So that means the equipment vendors are able to truly get started on the deployment, design, building, testing, deployment aspects of things. So it's typical that after a standard is settled, commercial products show up anywhere between 12 and 18 months from now. My expectation is that because this is an increment on top of LTE, we will begin to see pre-commercial activity, demos, trials, et cetera, like that, mid next year, with commercial product availability expectation probably around the end of next year on the network side. On the device side, it's maybe a bit of a different story. So the way the device side works is that typically you have a handful of chip makers who build in MulteFire into their chips and then provide them to the device manufacturers, who then take a spin of integrating, testing, and deploying those. So I think on the network side we'll see equipment availability, the APs and so on, available the second half of next year. I'm expecting, with devices available probably not until the end of next year, perhaps early 18. So I think from a broad rollout perspective, it's 2018, but there will be some engagements in the network in the form of demos, trials, and pre-commercial deployments and early commercial deployments yet in 2017. That's my expectation. We don't yet have any alliance member I'm aware of who has firmly planted their foot in, this is my schedule and my availability, but that's a reasonable expectation.
Thank you for the clarification. So we've had a number of questions come in asking about the availability and timing. And one interesting question that somebody offered was, will current LTE terminals support MulteFire?
It's really up to a device vendor. I mean, you can chime in as well. It's really up to the device vendors to have the support. I mentioned before there's a standard on the LTE side called LAA, which is intended to operate in the same unlicensed spectrum, although with the use of a licensed anchor. And from a technical perspective, the MulteFire addition on top of that is, dare I say, just software. It's much more than that. But from a technical perspective, a device that supports LAA would likely be physically capable of supporting MulteFire. So my guess would be that device vendors would certify MulteFire as a new software feature on a forward-looking chipset rather than a backward-looking chipset. But again, we don't necessarily have the commitment and understanding for them to do that. So my guess is that it would probably be rolling forward to a newer smartphone as opposed to backporting it to an older smartphone. But we have yet to hear the answer to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my impression from talking with the ecosystem suppliers is that there is a baseband impact in the terminal equipment, the smartphone, and that we'll have to see that technology arriving into the development stream for the devices. So the question of, well, can I take my existing Hero smartphone and expect a software upgrade and get MulteFire? My understanding is that is not the case. Amit, do you have any views on that?
No, I would agree, Ken, with what you just said. I think users cannot expect that, let's say, if they have a handset today that they're using right now, it would be possible to upgrade it to MulteFire. But I think, as Mike was mentioning earlier, it is possible that handset suppliers, who are building new handsets and delivering them in the 2017 timeframe, some of them may choose to build their handsets in a way that they are upgradable to MulteFire, even if initially they're just supporting, say, LTE, LAA, or other variants of LTE and unlicensed bands. But definitely, if you have a current handset, that handset would not work on MulteFire.
Yeah. What I think is very powerful is that the new feature that's coming for license-assisted access is quite sought after by service providers, mobile operators around the globe. And the companies that deliver silicon for the smartphones are very committed to making this happen. And MulteFire rides very nicely on top of that capability. I believe just a wee bit higher in the protocol stack. So it, from the point of view of taking advantage of license-assisted access to deliver MulteFire, it's pretty straightforward. And so as we see in 2017, the announcements of availability of new devices that embrace the coming standard, I think we can be sure that MulteFire will be just fast behind entering into the market. Well, let me ask, if we look past the arrival of MulteFire, with all complex technology activities, you can't come out with all the functionality at once. There usually are waves of improvements on a great idea. Mike, when you look at MulteFire, at this time where we're now looking down the road to 5G, and we have LTE Advanced Pro coming next year, and then an enhancement to that with another release from 3GPP. This is the release 14. Clearly, there are more things that are going to happen. What's your take on the evolution of MulteFire? Is there a long-term view for how the technology changes shape and maybe solves more problems?
Yeah, great question. Absolutely. So MulteFire, I tend to think of it as a feature that sits in the LTE ecosystem. And that's really a good way to think of it, because then MulteFire will ride forward on all the future standards improvements for LTE. An example you mentioned, LTE Release 14 is coming out. That, in fact, brings, going back to LAA, LAA defines unlicensed spectrum operation on the downlink in Release 13 and brings in the uplink portion in Release 14. MulteFire actually was created in concert with that to leverage the changes that will be in Release 14, actually a little bit ahead of time. And so MulteFire will continue to ride forward on the LTE standards, as well as bring some of its own performance improvements to the table. So, for example, Release 1.0 was the one that was just baseline. The work plan for MulteFire Release 1.1 has begun, and the 1.1 will focus on additional MulteFire-specific performance improvements, as well as taking a look at some Internet of Things feature set that are specific to MulteFire. We then have a Release 2.0 envisioned that would be the basis for a 5G, not 5 gigahertz, 5G flavor of MulteFire. So it will basically be an inherent part of the LTE ecosystem going forward. And in fact, we're even looking at merging the standards documents together and just having an inherent part of the 3GPP ecosystem and standards body going forward. So, yep, good point. MulteFire is coming out of the gate built on LTE, and will stay that way going forward, and we'll leverage and take advantage of all the improvements that the LTE standards body brings to the table in the future.
So that's an important initiative to maintain the trajectory of innovation that we have with LTE. Certainly one of the strengths behind LTE. Amit, could I ask you to reflect a bit on the applicability of MulteFire to an international market? A lot of the innovation around using LTE in unlicensed bands seems to have been centered in the U.S., with operators in the U.S. pushing for LTE unlicensed, which is not a standard. It's it's a specification that was put in place to kind of kickstart things. License-assisted access seems to have broader support. What's your take on MulteFire and its applicability in a global context?
Actually, I've seen a lot of interest in using LTE in unlicensed bands outside the U.S. So definitely there is the use of LTE in this licensed assisted mode, which is focused on service providers. And even though some of the U.S. operators like Verizon and T-Mobile started this so-called LTE unlicensed technology, later on, kind of the global operator community has embraced that idea, and now it is part of the formal standardization process. It's been standardized through the formal standardization process in globally called a body called 3GPP. So now I see operators around the world looking at it. And the main driver for these operators outside the U.S. is that in many countries there is limited amount of licensed spectrum that has been provided by their regulators, and there is growing demand for mobile data, and operators are very interested in seeing how they could couple their licensed spectrum with unlicensed. Secondly, if you look outside the world, and now this is in the context of MulteFire, there are even service providers who today use Wi-Fi for providing like broadband access to homes. So this is in the outdoor Wi-Fi deployment model, and those operators, I think they'll be like wireless internet service providers, are saying, well, if we could utilize the more robust air interface that LTE offers, then we can provide much better internet access to our subscribers. So there is interest from that whole community outside the U.S. And then definitely all the benefits that we talked about for the enterprise environment in terms of, security, support for IoT, fewer access points, support for VoLTE. So all the enterprise benefits that we talked about earlier are just as applicable to enterprises outside the U.S., whether it's in Europe or Asia or Latin America. So all those benefits continue to apply. So I think there is going to be a lot of interest in MulteFire around the world. And you see that interest reflected in the MulteFire Alliance's membership as well. The Alliance's membership includes not just U.S. companies, but leading companies from around the globe right now.
Excellent. So we received a very interesting question on through the web interface. Let me pose it to you, Amit. Use case: an enterprise is providing construction site support for all of the complex activities that occur in a complex building of a structure. Is MulteFire a useful capability in that environment? What does it take to deploy MulteFire in that type of ad hoc, chaotic situation? What's the impact on backhaul? Could you perhaps paint in our listeners' mind's eye how this might take shape?
Sure. So, MulteFire is deployed in the 5 gigahertz spectrum, which is today used for Wi-Fi. So when you're deploying it at this construction site, there is no requirement for any new spectrum. It goes in the same unlicensed spectrum that is available for Wi-Fi right now. Now, typically the products that would be available would be for deployment would be access points, and depending upon the supplier that you decide to choose, there may be different form factors, or might have slightly different coverage areas or different antenna configurations, but you would have a set of access points, and you can definitely deploy them in a relatively ad hoc fashion. And again, they would connect back to the internet over whatever backhaul that you have coming to the building. So if it's at a construction site, maybe you have some kind of wireless backhaul. If the site is remote, maybe there is satellite backhaul. There is really no, at least MulteFire is not imposing any new backhaul restrictions. You can think of the backhaul in the same way that you would think of backhaul from a Wi-Fi access point perspective. One of the benefits from a construction site point of view of using MulteFire would be that you would need a fewer set of access points, so it's easier to deploy in this ad hoc environment. And you may be able to you might get nice support for certain, let's say, communication applications, like if you want to support voice throughout the construction site, do that in a reliable fashion, or push-to-talk like applications. So all those things would work quite nicely on MulteFire, and there is no special requirement for spectrum or backhaul, different from what you would have from say a Wi-Fi deployment that you would do today.
It is quite a future. Seems that it introduces very interesting options for enterprise IT planners as they look forward to the evolution of the technology. So we'll be wrapping up. I'd like to just pose a question, and the answer, I think, might be on the next slide. Amit, do you want to talk a bit about how enterprises can actually help influence MulteFire going forward?
I think the best way would be to participate in discussions in the MulteFire Alliance, and bring their ideas to the and requirements and needs to the conversation. I think you just put up a slide about the Alliance. There's a lot of information available on the Alliance website as well. And at this stage, all of us who are existing members would really welcome more enterprises to join and provide their feedback. And of course, they can also continue to provide feedback through companies that are members of the Alliance right now that they might work with. So companies like Nokia or ourselves, SpiderCloud, or a wide range of companies who are participating. If you work with any of these companies and they are your vendors, or you could definitely bring up MulteFire, and I'm sure they'll be happy to take your feedback into the Alliance.
Wonderful. Mike, do you have any concluding remarks that you'd like to highlight?
Well, as we're looking at the list of companies here that are part of the Alliance, you'll see there's a broad array of network providers, service providers, cable companies, and really a global reach of those folks who are involved. So I think I would probably add that it, from a specification perspective, while the initial release is now kind of buttoned up and we're moving down the road to some improvements, there are some advantages to understanding a little bit more about the technology. There are going to be some business model works done out of the Alliance. There's going to be some deployment model works done out of the Alliance. And I see a couple of questions scrolling across the screen now that maybe deal a bit deeper with the technology. And so I believe that the Alliance is actually going to look into the possibility of publishing its spec to non-members. We'll probably know that within a month or two if we'll do that. But for those folks who are interested in the technology, I think the Alliance website even has some technical talks that go a bit deeper into, how do you manage interference with Wi-Fi? What about the distance analysis and the performance improvements of MulteFire versus Wi-Fi, et cetera. I think there may be some technical collateral that's available on the Alliance webpage for folks to dig a bit deeper. Now, because it is an Alliance, not all the technical specifications are available to non-members, but there are different levels of membership in terms of joining the Alliance, some of which are very affordable for companies that want to learn a bit more about this early on and help steer their own companies in terms of technology choices that will be laid out in the next couple of years. So I would just encourage people to consider that, browse the website, get a little bit more information there, and then we'd be happy, of course, to answer any questions that come in via the website or come in to us just individually. So I'd leave it at that.
Excellent. Well, thank you to everyone who has participated in the webinar today. For more information, please contact the Alliance through the information that has been posted on the webinar screen. And thank you. Have a good day. We look forward to a MulteFire future.